Skepticism is probably one of the most famous topics from contemporary philosophy. Like, even people who have not really studied philosophy have heard about these kinds of thought experiments, where we wonder, well, maybe we are just a brain in a vat being manipulated by scientists in such a way that we seem to experience this world around us, but actually that world isn't there. Right? We are familiar with those kinds of scenarios and with questions about knowledge that they generate. Like, if that's possible, if maybe we are brains in a vat being manipulated by scientists to have fake experiences, can we know anything at all? Right? Doesn't that mean that we can know nothing, that everything is uncertain, that everything is, that we're really not justified in believing anything? So skepticism seems pretty familiar, I would say. And one of the things I want to do in this video is to make it a little bit less familiar by putting it into a historical context. So what I want to do at the beginning of the video is we'll briefly discuss skepticism in the ancient world. And then we move on to Descartes in the 17th century, like the most famous of all writers about skepticism, and we will discuss how his use of skepticism, which is much closer to our use of skepticism, differs from that of the ancient Greeks. Okay, so when we look at ancient Greek philosophy, of course, the people we think of most are Plato and Aristotle. And that means that it's kind of tempting to believe that ancient Greek philosophy after Aristotle was always dominated by the Platonists and the Aristotelians. And that's not really true. It's not really true because in the centuries after Aristotle, philosophy in the Hellenistic world, as we call it, sort of the Greek-speaking world, or the world which is under Greek cultural influence, philosophy there is actually dominated by several schools which mostly do not come out of Plato and all of which do not come out of Aristotle. And those schools, the most important of them, are the Stoics, the Epicureans, and the Skeptics. Now, the Skeptics actually do come out of Plato's philosophy, but that is a little bit surprising to us, and maybe it would have been a little bit surprising to Plato too. Now, if you have ever read any Platonic dialogues, then depending on which you have read, you might have come out with a very different experience. So one possible experience when reading a Platonic dialogue is, wow, Plato is setting up all these very complicated theories. Right? That happens, for instance, in a dialogue like the Republic, where Plato tries to paint a picture of the ideal state, and he seems to be, positing a lot of philosophical theories and defending them with arguments. But there are also dialogues, and usually we think that they are the earlier dialogues that he wrote, in which Socrates usually is trying to find a definition for a certain term. He's trying to get insight into something. And he fails, right? He talks to someone, he hopes to be enlightened. It turns out that all the answers that he gets are wrong. And he ends up in a, situation where he still doesn't know what courage or knowledge or whatever is. And the other person who thought that they knew what it was also ends up, not knowing, right? They finally realize that they don't know what courage really is or what knowledge really is. And it seems that those dialogues were a big source of inspiration for some of Plato's direct followers. So maybe not his most direct followers, but pretty soon after Plato's death, his school turned into a skeptical school. And because Plato's school was called the Academy, we call this academic skepticism. And so the academic skeptics were skeptical about the possibility of gaining knowledge. And the way that these academic skeptics worked was roughly like this, right? What they would do is they would confront the knowledge claims of other philosophers. And they particularly liked to pick on the Stoics, because the Stoics were sort of outgoing, made a lot of big claims about the world and about our place in the world. And the skeptics would listen to those claims, and then they would argue that the Stoics didn't know the kind of stuff that they thought they knew. Right? So what they do is they engage in debate and they engage in argument with these Stoics especially to show that their knowledge claims are overblown, that you can't know the kinds of things that the Stoics claim you know, that in fact, here are some methods for undermining lots of knowledge claims. And so they try to deflate, really, the philosophical pretensions of other schools. Again, especially the Stoic school. So, what the skeptics engage in is a kind of dialogical technique, right? Somebody makes claims and then you undermine those claims to show that, no, that's actually not real knowledge. We don't know that kind of stuff. Why would you do that? Well, I suppose one reason to do that is because you think that the other people are wrong, and if there's anything that gets philosophers going, it's the thought that somebody else is wrong and I can show them that they're wrong, right? But actually, the skeptics have another aim in mind, because they believe that if you follow the method of skepticism, if you suspend belief all the time, right? If you don't believe anything, if you don't sort of hold any doctrines, but if you follow the method of the skeptic and suspend belief all the time, then you will be living the good life. You will be living the good life because you will arrive at a state of tranquility. It's a state where, you're not like being pushed around by false beliefs, being angered by false beliefs. It's like, because you believe nothing, you can have a relaxed and tranquil state in which you have no expectations, and therefore you also can't be disappointed. And so, like this ancient skepticism that we find in the academy, it's dialogical, right? It reacts to other people, and it consists, to a large extent, of recipes for how to react to other people. And its aim is tranquility. So, that's going to be very different from the kind of skepticism that we find in somebody like Descartes, as I will say in a moment. One more thing that I want to add about this like ancient tradition of skepticism is sometimes we make a distinction between the academic skeptics and the Pyrrhonic skeptics. And it's a distinction that already in the ancient world, the skeptics themselves were sort of arguing about. Like, what's an academic skeptic? What is a Pyrrhonic skeptic? The academic skeptics presumably taking their cue from Plato's Academy, the Pyrrhonic skeptics taking their cue from Pyrrho. Some people, right, including the most famous of the Pyrrhonist skeptics, which is who was a doctor called Sextus Empiricus, claim that the academics claimed to know that they knew nothing, right? They claimed to know that they knew nothing, which seems like a strange philosophical position to take because it immediately undermines itself, right? If you know that you know nothing. And then the Pyrrhonists would be the sort of better skeptics who don't claim that they know nothing because they claim nothing, right? I mean, they just have no beliefs. They just suspend judgment all the time. But it seems a little bit unclear whether that's a fair characterization of this distinction between the academic and the Pyrrhonic skeptic. One thing that is clear is that they have roughly the same kind of method here, right? It's dialogical and it's aimed at the good life of tranquility. Okay, so now what we're going to do is we're going to move forward to the 17th century. We're going to move forward to the time of René Descartes in the early 1600s. And this is a time of great intellectual upheaval. It's also a time at which ancient skepticism has once again become popular. It has become well known. I mean, the writings of Sextus Empiricus have been found. There are philosophers like Montaigne who actually try to revive skeptical ideas. So it's something that people are interested in and that they know about. Now, when Descartes comes up with his famous skeptical scenarios in his meditations, what he is doing is he is really reinventing skepticism in a way that makes it completely different from the skepticism of the ancient world. Because, first of all, Descartes' skepticism is not going to be dialogical. Right? He's not going to be there to confront other philosophers and claim that their knowledge claims are false. His opponent is not a Stoic, and his opponent is really not anyone else either, except you could say for himself. Because what René Descartes does in the Meditations is he says, look, I want to have like certain beliefs that I can know for sure are true. But in order to do that, I have to clear my mind. And in order to clear my mind, I have to make sure that I doubt everything. And that's when he starts bringing in these skeptical scenarios, right? Scenarios like the evil demon who might be deceiving me, right? And giving me all these experiences that aren't really real, they're fake. So he brings that in as a sort of mental tool for me to clear my mind, right? To stop believing the things that I have hitherto believed. Why? Well, because then I can start building up knowledge from scratch, and I can make sure to do it in such a way that everything I believe is going to be certainly true. Right? So that is Descartes' idea. And what we see here is that skepticism is not a reaction against this person's knowledge claims or that person's knowledge claims, and it's not something that's supposed to get me to a state where I suspend judgment and therefore have a tranquil life. No. Skepticism is a way to criticize my own ideas, make me get rid of all of those that can't withstand the criticism, and thereby improve my knowledge and get to what for Descartes is the real certainty. So Descartes' skepticism works in a different way. It's sort of internal to the system, not directed against other people's ideas, and it has a different aim. And the aim is not suspension of belief. No, on the contrary, the aim is to really criticize one's own ideas so that only the best ones will remain. Right? So that only the best ones will remain. And it's fair to say that this is how skepticism has continued to be used, not only by Descartes in the 17th century, but all the way up until now in the 21st century. When philosophers nowadays talk about skepticism, they usually do not use skepticism in anything like the ancient way. Rather, like Descartes, they use skepticism to investigate our current epistemological ideas, right? To see whether they can stand up to skepticism. And the hope is, well, it's not so much Descartes' hope that now we will get to certain knowledge, but it is the hope that we will get to good epistemological theories, right? Good epistemological theories have to show us that knowledge is possible. And so skeptical arguments that aim to show that knowledge is not possible are a sort of way to test our epistemological theories. And if your epistemological theory is killed by skepticism, right? Skepticism comes and shows that if your theory is accepted, we don't have knowledge, well, then that's a theory that we should throw out, and we should try to come up with a new and better epistemological theory. So that's the way that skepticism gets used nowadays. Not so much as a way to get to tranquility or to defeat other people's positions, but as a methodological tool to improve our own epistemological ideas. Okay, one more thing that I want to talk about here is the content of the skeptical scenarios. So, what the ancient skeptics were basically always saying was, of course, that these other philosophers were wrong. And in particular, one thing that the ancient skeptics liked to point out is that we can't really rely on perception. Right? We can't really rely on perception because perception is sometimes wrong, because perception is it's different for different people, it's different for different species. I mean, there's lots of uncertainty that is generated by, all kinds of things that we could say about perception. And so that's an area that they really focus on. But here is something that they never do. Here is something that the ancient skeptics never talk about. They never talk about the existence of the external world, right? Nobody in ancient skepticism says, well, maybe all our perceptions are not really of a world that exists, right? Maybe all of our perceptions are just illusions and there is no world outside us. None of them do, right? It's just not an idea that exists in ancient skepticism, or really before, people like Descartes. So how is that possible, right? I mean, you have hundreds of years of skeptics, and they never come up with external world skepticism. And then in Descartes, that becomes like the form that skepticism takes. And it's a form that, it's the most famous form and the form that a lot of contemporary philosophers feel obliged to talk about. So where does it come from, this external world skepticism? I want to briefly tell a historical tale about that too, which I take mostly from the analysis of Richard Rorty in Philosophy and the Mirror of Nature. So here's the way that Rorty tells the story. He says, look, what happens between the ancient world and Descartes is that people start thinking about the human mind in a different way, right? If you think about the mind and the body, the way that people conceive of these categories in the ancient world, and you can see that in these ancient Greek philosophers, but you can also still see it in somebody like Augustine, sort of in relatively late antiquity, and this just continues until, more or less the time of Descartes. They think about it in terms of the distinction between the eternal and the temporal. And so there's something special when we contemplate eternal truths, like the truths of mathematics, or maybe for people like Augustine, the truths about God. Right? Those are eternal, unchanging truths. And there's something, that's something different. The eternal, that's something different than the temporal. Right? And maybe for some, but not all of these philosophers, that means that the human being is kind of split, right, into an eternal part and a temporal part. Okay. Well, here's the important thing for our purposes. When you think of sense perception, right, when you think about what you are sensing right now, that clearly belongs to the temporal part, right? As does the world of objects around us. So that all belongs together, right? There's no sort of philosophically interesting split between, on the one hand, my sense perceptions, and on the other hand, the things that I'm supposedly seeing. And so, there's no reason to be philosophically interested in a supposed gap between perception and things, right? That thought doesn't really come up, and if the thought comes up, it doesn't seem very pregnant, very important. Okay, says Rorty. Well, here is how Descartes thinks about mind and body. What is special about the mind for Descartes is that it is immediately accessible, right? That we can have certainty about it, or that we have a sort of privileged access to it, right? What is the mind is what we would now maybe call consciousness, right? And the contents of consciousness are the things that I immediately know, right? They're there. That's what I experience. And everything else, I do not experience in the same way. It's not as accessible to me. It's not maybe certain, or at least not in the first instance. Like, what is certain and accessible to me, like immediately, are the contents of my mind. And if that's the way that you start thinking about the mind, then there suddenly is a huge and gigantic gap between my perception as something in my consciousness and the object in the world, right? Because in my consciousness there's this tree, okay, but is there also a tree independent of my consciousness in the world? Well, that's a serious question, right? That's a question that philosophy has to answer. And that's a question that is basically the question of the external world. And so if we worry that we don't have an answer, we get external world skepticism. And so because of a new way of thinking about the mind as the internal, accessible, conscious, rather than as the eternal, what we see is that at the heart of metaphysics, ontology, epistemology, we get this distinction between the internal mind and the external world, and that generates the form of skepticism that is most famous today, and that is sort of crucial and central to Descartes' own thinking about these topics.